Everybody to this special seminar. I'm glad everybody made it. There's a few who are new, so I just want to say my name is Charles Small, and I'm the director of the Yale Initiative for the Interdisciplinary Study of Anti-Semitism, and we're based here at ISPS. So today it's an honor to have Grahame Davies with us today. Today he's going to speak on, the title of his talk is From Philo-Semitic to Anti-Semitic, Shifts in attitude towards the Jewish people among Western European minority community. Mr. Davies is a poet, editor, and literary critic. He's from Wales. He was brought up in a village near Wexham in the northeast part of Wales. After gaining a degree in English literature from the CCAT, which is now Anglica Ruskin University in Cambridge, he qualified as a journalist with the Thomson Organization and worked on newspapers in South Wales. His career in journalism and TV as a TV producer brought him a number of Welsh and UK industrial awards. In 1997, he was awarded a doctorate at the University of Wales for his study, written in Welsh, of the works of R.S. Thomas and Saundra Lewis, T.S. Eliot, and Simone de Beauvoir, who he identified as part of an anti-modern trend in Western culture in the 20th century. And I know from colleagues internationally, in Israel and Europe, that many people have actually been writing in envious that we have him with us today, and we're actually videotaping it so it can be part of our archive, so scholars from around the world can actually see this in a couple of days. So it's really a pleasure that you're here, and thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you very much, Cindy, for the contacts and all the assistance in arranging my visit here. Now, this is the first time I've been to New Haven, the first time to Yale University, but I am actually an alumnus of a different Yale in my hometown of Wrexham in North Wales, which of course is where LU Yale is buried, where his family came from, where he is buried. And the local sixth form college, which I attended between 16 and 18, is called Yale Sixth Form College. So when I went to university, I had the experience of referring casually to when I was at Yale, and of course, which to somebody from Wrexham means the local sixth form college, not the world famous institution of learning. But I'm very glad to be in what I suppose I have to call the real Yale College, as you're very much older than my sixth form. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry it couldn't be a happier subject than anti-Semitism, but there we are. So I'm going to begin this lecture with two quotations. Both of them are translated from the Welsh language. Now here's the first translation. This is from somebody called T. Ap Simon, and he was a cultured young Welsh speaker serving as a British Army captain and writing for a magazine in October 1917, just after the Third Battle of Gaza, in which Allied forces broke through from Egypt into Palestine. And here's the quote. "Is our host, like the host of Joshua, a chosen instrument to redeem the land from its Turkish oppressor? Is perhaps the time drawing near when the old nation will come back again to its land forever? The old godly people of Wales used to sing so often in their missionary prayer meetings, the prophecies will be fulfilled, all the promises will be made complete. And the return of the seed of Abraham to his land was a strong element in their petitions. If we have the privilege of preparing the way for the old nation to return, then we will have done something to be proud of. And remember that young Welsh people are doing their part." He's writing home from the front to a magazine in Wales. Here he is again, a couple of months later, writing in Jerusalem on December the 11th, 1917, the day when Allied forces entered the Holy City. "Everything portends a fine future for the land after the war. The utopia of the prophets will be seen as a fact before long in Palestine. The Hebrew schools are alive, and the Hebrew language is being taught despite the opposition of the atheists and the millionaires. The Jew has proved before the world his ability and his suitability to form a national life. Hail to him, and may he succeed. Now, this wasn't simply empty rhetoric. Thousands and thousands of British soldiers died in that campaign, and that worldview, that sense that they were redeeming the Holy Land, which they knew then was given to the Jewish people, was common. This wasn't an eccentric view. This was mainstream. Now, here's the second quotation, and this is coming up to the present day now. This is from the main Welsh language internet forum, and this is from a year ago. And this has been written by a cultured young Welshwoman. Jew equals Israeli, equals the bone of contention, equals the enemy of the modern Welshman, and the rest of the civilized anti-materialist world. And if you don't understand this simple formula, you may as well go there to live, as long as Israel exists. And that won't be for long, hopefully. And some more. Now, other people on this forum are remonstrating with her and saying you can't say that kind of thing. She responds, and they say, well, you know, other nations do things wrong. Why are you picking on the Jewish people? She said, I have reason and evidence against the Jews. And looking carefully at the evidence, they're guilty. Israel's like a rampant cuckoo in the nest, fouling the nest and claiming it for itself with its little eye for an eye mind and its beak and its claws in the skulls of little Palestinian children. And there's more. Another debater tries to demonstrate with her. She responds, have you been circumcised or what? There's more. This would close any argument, she says. Well done, the Welshman. Bugger the Jew. This is 2006. I'm not saying this is mainstream discourse, but this is growing out of what I suspect is the same national community. Now, there were contrary voices, though that view did not go unchallenged. And the webmaster indeed banned her for those comments. But it's deeply troubling that 90 years after the writing of the first piece I quoted, someone who is a direct inheritor of the values of the same small cultural group could write something so perverse, and feel, no doubt, that they were in the same tradition of supporting the underdog. So in this talk, I want to show how one community, the Welsh, who consider themselves, with some justification, much justification historically, to be an oppressed minority, have related to the Jewish people. I think this may provide some insights into the dynamics of philo and anti-Semitism within at least one Western European minority group, and it may open up some wider issues for discussion. Who do I mean by the Welsh? I mean, of course, the small Celtic nation, 3 million people on England's western border, the first country conquered by England when it was expanding in 1282, and the last to regain some partial independence in 1997. So, please bear in mind when I'm talking about Welsh attitudes that given 7 centuries of English rule in Wales, much Welsh public opinion was, and still is, the same as England's. The amount of distinctiveness is actually quite slight. So I'm concentrating on that distinctive element, and that distinctive element is largely confined to the intelligentsia. The intelligentsia, like all intelligentsias, tends to be more radical than the majority. So I wouldn't want you to think that these are widespread attitudes. They are confined to the intelligentsia and a section of that intelligentsia, not all of it. So the intelligentsia of which I'm speaking is considerably more nationalistic, more Welsh-speaking, more left-wing than the wider population. Now, my own background, I have no Jewish background. I encountered Judaism in the 1990s when I was writing my doctorate on those 4 writers you mentioned. T.S. Eliot, of course, had a famously anti-Semitic speak, or made some famously anti-Semitic comments. He had a Welsh follower from a distance, Saunders Lewis, who picked up his anti-Semitism along with his other cultural attitudes. Then there was Simone Weil, French, Jewish, very likely self-hating. And then I had another voice who was neither Jewish nor anti-Semitic. But I was writing about this and realised that I couldn't write about anti-Semitism or Jewish self-hate until I'd encountered Judaism in some form. So I arranged a visit to the local synagogue, and this led to an instant fascination with the Jewish people, with their history, with their religion. And it It's led now to three trips to Israel. So this book, The Chosen People, which is a collection of writings about the dealings of the Welsh and the Jewish people. And this book was called An Example of British Philo-Semitism, and if that's what it is, I'm very glad. Now, I was to look at the Philo-Semitic strand and the Anti-Semitic strand in the Welsh intelligentsia's response. The Philo has historically been the dominant strain. Now, when did the Welsh first encounter the Jewish people? Well, from as early as the 6th century, there's a long history of the Welsh, like any number of groups who perceive themselves as disenfranchised, aggrandizing and glamorizing their own status by borrowing moral authority from the biblical Israel. Now, this is a process which I think is impertinent, it's understandable, it's impertinent, and it's still in a way an implicit compliment to the Jewish people. It's not something I encourage, but it happens. The same kind of thing is behind the claim that Joseph of Arimathea came to Wales with the Holy Grail. In the 18th century, there was a belief, a very widespread belief in Wales and beyond, that the Welsh and their language were descended from the Jewish people and from Hebrew. They're not. Welsh isn't descended from Hebrew. But this was very widely believed. What was going on? The Welsh wanted status. They wanted to play on the European stage when vernacular cultures were developing, and to do that in those days you needed an antecedent, you needed to be of noble descent of some kind. Anything would do. There was a strong belief that the Welsh were descended from the Trojans. There's some evidence of that in Shakespeare when Henry V, where the Welsh character is called a base Trojan, because we're not descended from the Trojans, but we wanted to be descended from somebody so we could be more informed. But those are fantasy rather than reality. Real contact happened probably in the 12th century during the Crusades. Thousands of Welshmen went on these, and they would have encountered Jewish communities. But I have been through the abundant Welsh medieval literature of the period, and I can't find any extensive passages dealing with the Jews. All I can find by use of the index is if you look up the word "ither," which means Jew, you look it up in the text, it's used as an insult. Not an insult to Jews, but an insult to Gentiles, to whom various characteristics are being attributed. So it's there. This is general Catholic Christian medieval prejudice against the Jews. Wales was clearly not immune from that. 1290, of course, Edward I, who conquered Wales, expelled the Jews from Britain, and the opportunity for further real contact didn't arrive until the resettlement under Oliver Cromwell in the 17th century. So it's in this post-Reformation period that we find the familiar contours of Protestant Wales emerging, and the relationship between the Welsh and the Jewish people intensifying. This tended to be, we're thinking of Cromwell, Puritanism, millenarianism. It tended to take on a sense that the Jewish people needed to be converted to Christianity as a precursor of the Second Coming. And there are many examples of this in Welsh literature. Welsh divines and poets. George Herbert and Henry Vaughan, great mystical thought of as English poets, actually Welsh-born. Henry Vaughan actually Welsh-speaking. 16th and 17th centuries, they shared these ideas. And here's a poem from Vaughan, addressing the Jewish people. Faith sojourned first on earth in you. You were the dear and chosen stock, the arm of God, glorious and true, was first revealed to be your rock. You were the eldest child, and when your stony heart despised love, the youngest, even the Gentiles then were cheered, your jealousy to move. So this is substitutionism across the Christian church being seen as superseding the Jewish people. After the resettlement, there were isolated Jewish individuals in Wales, itinerant traders, some small mercantile communities from the mid-18th century on. But only really in visits to London synagogues did Welsh Christians encounter real Jewish people. One of those, however, gave the English-speaking church the most Jewish of all Christian hymns, the God of Abraham Praise. I don't know if you've ever come across that. It's still sung. You'll find it in hymnals. If you ever find yourself in a Christian church, have a look for, in the index, the God of Abraham Praise. It's there in most mainline hymnals. It was written by Thomas Olivers. He was an 18th century Methodist preacher. He was a friend of John Wesley. a good enough friend to be buried in the same grave as him. So they obviously were pretty close. He went to the Great Synagogue in London in 1770. He heard the cantor singing the Yigdal, was impressed with it, translated it into English, or had it translated, I don't know if he spoke Hebrew, translated it, paraphrased it, Christianized it, and set it to one of the tunes given to him by the cantor. First verse, it's a long hymn, 10 verses. The God of Abraham praise, who sits enthroned above, ancient of everlasting days and God of love. Jehovah, great I am, by earth and heaven confess, as thou and bless the sacred name, forever blessed. Because he mentions Jesus a couple of times later, he interprets references to Jesus. So this is a pretty sympathetic engagement of evangelicalism with Judaism. But we're not quite yet at the point where evangelical Protestantism found common cause with Zionism. This is a little before Zionism, of course. We're still talking about conversionism here. And although it was sympathetic, there was also tension. And there's an example, a cause célèbre in 1867, which was actually known as the Cardiff Jewess abduction case. And this happened when a young woman called Esther Lyons, 18-year-old Jewish woman, had troubles at home, ran away, confided in a Christian friend who passed her on to conversionist Welsh Baptists, who spirited her away out of the country completely, while her father tried to get her back. And the father eventually issued a writ of habeas corpus, this ancient law which compels you to literally have the body to release them. A writ of habeas corpus to get her back. And it became a sensational court case. And in which, and this is interesting, public opinion was firmly on the side of the Jewish father, because they saw that the conversionists had acted deceitfully. And public opinion was firmly on his side. He won the case and got damages from the conversionists, but he didn't get his daughter back because she remained apparently willingly with her. I say apparently because she was never heard from her. But she was spoken to through intermediaries and they couldn't get her to come back. So, there was conversionism, but conversionism influenced the would-be converted as well, and with quite far-reaching consequences. In the mid-19th century, Welsh Calvinistic Methodists sponsored a long-term mission by a minister called John Mills to convert the Jewish people in London and Palestine. It might be hard to imagine just how confident Welsh-speaking Calvinistic Methodism must have been to have sponsored a mission to Jewish people in London and Palestine. And he never had any converts at all, not a single one. But he learned Hebrew, he befriended, he explained Christianity to Jewish people, and he explained Judaism to British people, to Christian people, which wasn't done a great deal. And there's a little quote here from him. This is all translated from Welsh. He visits Palestine, and a rabbi offers a prayer for him. And afterwards, John Mills records, "My heart melted in pity for them. They had indeed honoured me beyond everything, praying publicly for a Christian minister. It was indeed a new thing on the earth. And I thought and pondered for a while, remembering how our fathers in Wales used to pray warmly for the Jews, and how that has now been almost completely forgotten. And I asked the God of all mercies to restore it to our congregations of every denomination. Oh, how delightful it would be if the Jew were remembered in every service throughout Wales, every Sabbath, every week. Who knows how soon the prayer of the synagogue might come to end, not with Amen, but through Jesus Christ, Amen." And so he goes on. Conversionism, yes, of course. But it's warm. There's a relationship, an admiration there. And this is important for later developments, because, of course, in Christian thought, the second coming was dependent not just on the conversion of the Jewish people, it was dependent on their return to Israel from exile. So, albeit for their own reasons, Welsh Christians had a foundation of identification with the Zionist project when that began. And this affected not just firebrand evangelicals, even nominal Christians, people like George Eliot. Now, she was born Mary Ann Evans, and if you've seen that booklet which the Welsh government gave me to give out at any talks, you'll see Evans is a Welsh name, and she was of Welsh ancestry. Her father prided himself on the idea that he was of noble Welsh descent. I don't think he was. The village his ancestors came from was called North of Hall. It's the name of a village, but I think he thought Hall meant that he was an aristocrat, and consequently he fostered these ideas. First thing George Eliot ever wrote was based on this idea of a remote ethnic prestige. And of course she wrote Daniel Deronda, where somebody who's brought up in one culture discovers that he actually has a prestigious, glamorous ethnic heritage. It's not too far to imagine that her own preoccupation and her own family's preoccupation with their different roots may have influenced the scenario of Daniel Deronda, which itself, of course, influenced Zionism and the revival of Hebrew. Theodore Herzl came to Cardiff in 1895 to promote his ideals, and he met Colonel Albert Goldschmidt. He was a senior British Army officer, an ardent Zionist, who was bringing up his children Hebrew-speaking in Cardiff in the late 1890s. He'd been born Jewish, but brought up a Gentile by adoptive parents, and then he rediscovered his roots and became, reconnected with Judaism. He met Theodore Herzl and said, "I am Daniel Deronda," because he identified with that image. Let's have a look at Welsh Zionism from the Jewish perspective, because by now, after the pogroms in Eastern Europe, there were Jewish communities, substantial Jewish communities in the industrial districts of South Wales. And we've got here Lily Tobias. She is the maternal aunt of the great Welsh Jewish poet Danny Absey, who's now in his 80s, you may have read his work. And she was a Welsh-speaking Jewish woman. And she wrote a remarkable collection of short stories about pre-World War I Welsh Zionism. And this was published in a book called The Nationalists. And the cover of The Nationalist actually has the Welsh dragon within a Star of David. It was remarkable. It's not good literature at all, but it's because everything is about Zionism, and there's no character development or anything. It's like they talk about Zionism. Should we go to Palestine? Oh yes, I think it's the best thing for our people. And then the next thing is 20 years later they met in Jerusalem, and it kind of jumps on. Just it's only interested in Zionism and nothing else. But it's fascinating as a historical document. And what we see through this is that Welsh nationalism, evangelicalism and Zionism are in a kind of benign fusion at this time, as she saw it. Now, this is because the interests of the intelligentsia in Wales were identifying their own national aspirations with those of the still expanding British Empire, which and was seeking to play a junior but important part in that. So they were not in any way hostile to Zionism. So in Tobias's stories, Welsh nationalists are invariably portrayed very sympathetically, and anglicised Welsh people are criticised. Several Welsh characters, particularly religious ones, are shown to be more sensitive to Jewish identity and to Zionism than some Jewish people. This next extract, a young Jewish woman who is actually assimilationist, she wants to blend in, she meets a Welsh friend's elderly uncle. It begins with an exclamation, Merchanwyl, that means, dear girl. Merchanwyl, he exclaimed in his broad, emphatic accents. And proud I am to meet you for sure. Why, I do love the Jews. Indeed I do. You are the people of the book, and the Lord will show his wonders through you yet. You have got a big job in front of you, my girl. And what is that, Mr. Jones? Asked Sarah politely as she recovered her breath. The return to Zion, my girl, said the old man solemnly. Oh, as I could live to see the day. Looking at it from the Welsh perspective, same period, here's a translation from a quote, Crwys, written in 1918, talking about the Jewish hope of return. He said, for nearly 2,000 years, this confidence has burned in his heart, and tempests only fan the flame higher. By today, are there not clear signs that the old dream is almost realized, that the Zionism of recent times has almost succeeded in its desire, and that the sound of the striking of the old wanderer's tents can be heard in the ends of the earth? Until that day dawns, let the Jew take comfort in remembering that it is he who has given the world the surest of all the laws, that in the vessel of his language and ancient literature has been transported the treasure of revelation in every age, and that from his broad loins have come philosophers like Paul and Spinoza and Moses Mendelssohn, and poets like David and Heine, and musicians like Felix Mendelssohn, and philanthropists like Rothschild. If this is not enough, let it be also remembered that a Jew called Jesus is the ruler of the world, and that if every Jew returns to his land, more than 7 nations will grasp at his hem, saying, abide with me. So this is quite heated rhetoric, isn't it? There's high expectations. Yeah. But aspirations are one thing, sympathies another thing. But of course this return couldn't happen without political power. And the Welsh connection here is very significant because Wales played a key role here because the British Prime Minister during the First World War was Lloyd George, Welsh-speaking Welshman, a nationalist in his early days, brought up on exactly that kind of rhetoric. So when Chaim Weizmann went to him during the war, calling in the favour for the solution he brought to the Allied munitions industry, and Churchill said, what can I do to reward you? And Chaim Weizmann just said, well, we want a chance to have a home for our people. And he persuaded Lloyd George to put that idea to the War Cabinet, and the War Cabinet, of course, endorsed it, and the British then backed that up with force and conquered Palestine. Now, here is David Lloyd George putting that into his own words in 1925, talking to the Jewish Historical Society of England, and he's explaining his support for Zionism. It was undoubtedly inspired by natural sympathy, admiration, and also by the fact that we had been trained even more in Hebrew history than in the history of our own country. I was brought up in a school where I was taught far more about the history of the Jews than about the history of my own land. I could tell you all the kings of Israel, but I doubt whether I could have named half a dozen of the kings of England. I don't know if you read in current affairs currently, but Gordon Brown said more or less exactly that very recently. And of course he's a son of the mouse. He echoed that. He wasn't deliberately echoing Lloyd George. He made exactly that same rhetorical point. I go on. And not more of the kings of Wales. So that you must remember that was very largely the basis of our teaching. On 5 days a week in the day school, and on Sunday in our Sunday schools, we were thoroughly versed in the history of the Hebrews. We used to recite great passages from the prophets and the Psalms. We were thoroughly imbued with the history of your race in the days of its greatest glory, when it founded that great literature which will echo to the very last days of this old world, influencing, moulding, fashioning human character, inspiring and sustaining human motive, not only for Jews, but Gentiles as well. We absorbed it and made it part of the best in the Gentile character, so that therefore, when the question was put to us, we had all that in our minds, so that the appeal came to sympathetic and educated on that question, intelligent hearts. But I'm not going to pretend that there was not a certain element of interest in it. Too, you call yourself a small nation, I belong to a small nation, and I'm proud of the fact this is an ancient race, not as old as yours. And although I'm very proud of it, I'm not going to compare it with yours. One day it may become great, it may perhaps be chosen for great things, but all I know is that up to the present it is small races that have been chosen for great things. And there we were, confronted with your people in every country in the world, very powerful. You may say you have been oppressed and persecuted. That has been your power. You have been hammered into very fine steel. And that is why you can never be broken. Hammered for centuries into the finest steel of any race in the world. And therefore, we wanted your help. He's a real politician. I remember he's talking to a Jewish audience after the event. But there's a lot of truth in that all the same. And you've got political will, but of course you also need military force. And Lloyd George realised how well the conquest of Palestine, of the holy places, would play with his core constituency back home in Wales, religious, Bible-believing, evangelical Christians. And he made sure that the reinforced British Allied forces in Egypt, which was the British base at the time, were reinforced with as many Welsh troops as they could possibly spare, so that when they had the final campaign in 1917 to conquer Palestine, they could present this as a Welsh victory. And that's exactly what they did. But it cost thousands of lives because the Turks were not in any way a pushover, and they weren't going to vacate the places they'd held for 400 years at the wake of a non-conformist hymn book. But it was costly. But they were up for it, these soldiers. Many of them shared these ideals. So I'll go back to T. Ap Simon, whom we heard about at the beginning, and he's writing this the day that Allied forces entered Jerusalem. It is the brotherly love of the Jew which is the explanation of the success of the colonies. He was the early Zionist colonies. They have a proverb that all Israel is responsible for one another. Under the inspiration of that principle, the rich Jew extends help to the man who is in his debt. The gentleness and the care of that first prophet for the poor and those in danger of dying has come to the surface 4,000 years since the law was laid down. Perhaps this enlightened age has something to learn from Moses yet. I mentioned the entry into Jerusalem, and this is my one slide. It's that. Now, don't know if you can see it very well. That's paintings by Frank Brangwyn. It was painted in the, oh, you can get the lights, thank you. I'll only spend a moment on this. This was painted in the 1930s as a Welsh war memorial project, and it's called The Entry of the Welsh Troops into Jerusalem. They're going in on December the 11th, 1917. They're going in on foot, because it was the holy city and they weren't going to ride in or go in motor cars or have a gate dismantled like the Kaiser had done earlier to get in. They went in on foot. And that's the Jaffa Gate. Yeah. And so that hangs in the National Museum in Cardiff. So I mentioned this to see what a big public deal this was. This wasn't some kind of fringe interest of religion. This was total mainstream Welsh public thing. I'd been to the newspapers at the time. I'd looked at the microfilm and the Western Mail at the time, the local newspaper, rejoicing in Jewry is what it said when Jerusalem was captured. Enemy driven back by Welsh troops. This is the thing. This was seen as a Welsh victory. So that's, if you like, the high points of Welsh Philo-Semitism. And it seems a long while ago, a different world that could produce such a Bible-based response to current affairs. But it had an aftermath as well. We had the Mandate period, of course, and even up to the time when there was the vote on the partition of Palestine, we can find the strain of Welsh evangelical belief still flowing, not as strongly, but where it was flowing, it was flowing strongly. And here we have Rhys Howells, a Welsh evangelical Christian who has an extraordinary intercessory gift, and he's praying for the United Nations to create the Jewish state. And he said, we pleaded that because of his covenant with Abraham 4,000 years ago, God would take his people back to their land, and Palestine should again become a Jewish state. And when it did happen, he said that was one of the greatest days of the Holy Ghost in the history of these 2,000 years. So we're into the post-Second World War period now. And after that period, this Philo-Semitism still running strong. Post-war secular Welsh nationalism took inspiration from the restoration of Israel, the revival of Hebrew. This is a poet called Harry Webb, a poem called Israel. Listen, Wales. Here was a people whom even you could afford to despise, growing nothing, making nothing, belonging nowhere. A people whose sweat glands had atrophied, who lived by their wits, who lived by playing the violin. A lot better, incidentally, than you had played the harp. And because they were such a people, they went like lambs to the slaughter. But some survived. Yes, listen closer now. And these are the different people. They have switched off Mendelssohn and tuned into Maccabeus. The mountains are red with their blood. The deserts are green with their seed. Listen, Wales. So, Welsh nationalism drawing inspiration from the establishment of Israel. The revival of Welsh in the second half of the 20th century drew inspiration from the revival of Hebrew. We have Ulpan courses in Wales. They were imported into Wales in the early 1970s. I know many people who learned fluency in Welsh through Ulpans. So far, this seems like the story of the confluence of two related and in some ways complementary ambition: worldwide Zionism, evangelical Protestantism, exerting powerful leverage on the great power of the day, which was Great Britain. And it tells the story of how a community's consciousness of its minority status can impel it towards a productive solidarity with the Jewish people. But it wasn't all coverage. Anti-Semitism runs through the stream of Welsh-Jewish historical relations too, like a dark undercurrent. And this is the second and shorter section of my talk. I mentioned earlier that it was there early on, these mentions, pejorative references to Jewish people in early Welsh poetry. In the field of political rhetoric, we find Llywelyn ap Griffith. He was the last Prince of Wales. He was killed in battle in 1282. A couple of weeks before that, he was writing to the Archbishop of Canterbury, basically asking him to tell Edward I to leave them alone because they're a Christian nation. And he says, we've been persecuted by Edward I almost in the same way as the Saracens and the Jews. That's not solidarity. He's saying we are not infidels like the Saracens and the Jews. That's actually a distancing to us. So, some patriotic Welsh people like to think of themselves as more civilised than the English. We don't invade other countries, we don't impose our language or religion on them. We oppress ourselves, we don't oppress others. This is a comforting, self-affirming myth, but it's flawed. I mentioned the Cardiff Jewess abduction case of 1867, where conversionism became coercion. And worse, in 1911, during a time of industrial unrest, rioters looted Jewish businesses in some coal mining communities of South Wales. And as you see the film Solomon and Gaynor, the 1999 Oscar-nominated film that's set against that background. It's actually pretty accurate in its balanced portrayal of it. And what happened after that is that both communities, Welsh, British and Jewish, hushed this incident up. They didn't really want to make a big deal of it. But we have to acknowledge this is the one instance of communal violence in the UK since the resettlement, and it happened in Wales. And it was cited with British influences as well. So we see the dominant current of Welsh public opinion, broadly sympathetic, but this undercurrent of hostility. And this has affected some of Welsh literature's biggest names. There are not many of them, they're pre-Holocaust, and they're exceptional, but they must be noted. And the earliest of them is actually the worst. Owen Morgan Edwards, born 1858, died 1920. One of the fathers of modern Welsh nationalism, revered Oxford academic, MP, Chief Inspector of Schools, and in many ways very warm character, heroic, naive, idealistic, warm-hearted, and generous, which makes it all the more painful to record this instance of anti-Semitism. That's the worst example in Welsh literature. He went on a tour of Europe in 1889 and produced a travelogue called From Bala to Geneva, and he has an encounter with European Jewish communities, and he's moved to recall a story from Wales about how a local family had been ruined by the Jews, and as he puts it, a Jewish wolf falling on prey in the darkest hour. And he has this fantastic theory in which Jewish people go around Welsh hill farms tempting farmers with, yes, he says it, fine wines and jewels and silks. And the idea of a Welsh hill farmer falling for fine wines and silks and jewels is, of course, absurd. But the idea is that they get into debt and then the Jewish person distrains on their property and gets it. And he goes on, can one justify the hatred of the nations of the continent towards the Jews? I have thought a great deal before replying. Yes, without a doubt. Now he actually quotes the Protocols of the Elders of Zion uncritically, and he also goes on to say, to cite religious reasons for his anti-Semitism, and says, what is the work of the Jew today? He is everything except what God intended at the beginning for him to be. Inscribing the holiness of the Lord on the bridles of the horse, sanctifying the world, teaching religion to the nations was their work, but their whole soul is directed towards making money. The Jew does not talk about holiness and religion. Perhaps he does not understand what they are anymore. What about gold, jewellery and gems and fine clothes? He was sent to proclaim another world. He sold his soul for this world. Now, I can't find any of this in any of Edwards' other work. And in later editions, editors took this out completely. And elsewhere in his work, he actually uses Jewish material. I don't mean Old Testament material, I mean Jewish rabbinical teaching. He uses them for religious instruction. And yet he allowed himself, that's an extended passage, it goes on page after page after page, with embellishments. And he allowed himself that. So, that was there. Now, not the worst example of anti-Semitism in Welsh public life, but the most notorious is that of Saunders Lewis, 1893 to 1985. He's the central figure of 20th century Welsh nationalism. Founder of the Welsh Nationalist Party, which is now in government with the Labour Party in Wales. And he was English-born and bred, raised Welsh-speaking, and was led to nationalism by his experience of the destruction of European civilization in the First World War. And he saw a return to a pre-modern, organic, folk life as a protection against modern, mass, democratic society. And it sounds familiar, doesn't it? Because it's the incipient early fascism. And it had much in common with that and It was not a totalitarian vision, but unfortunately it was an anti-Semitic vision, and he picked this up from neo-Catholic French writers, neo-Catholic English writers like T.S. Eliot and G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc. And he put this into his work, and even as he went on and he carried out the climactic act, or the catalytic act of 20th century Welsh nationalism, which was burning a British Air Force bombing school, which was set up in Wales in the 1930s, and they committed a symbolic act of arson there, gave themselves up to the police, and became kind of martyrs for the cause as a result. This was a catalytic event. But if you look at Lewis's own rhetoric at the time, why did he think a war was coming? A war was coming because of usury. And of course that only means he was thinking this was a Jewish conspiracy to make money by making war. So this act, which is revered among Welsh nationalists as a self-sacrificial, non-violent act, is actually a darker background to it. In Lewis's own mind, he wasn't just fighting British militarism. Behind that, he was fighting Jewish capitalism and all that stuff. In his poems, we have a famous instance from a 1939 poem called The Deluge, and he referred to the supposed role of New York's Jewish financiers in causing the Depression. Then, as the quote, then on Olympus in Wall Street, 1929, busy at their immortal scientific task of guiding the prophets of fate, the gods, with their feet in the Aubusson carpets and their Hebrew noses in the quarters of statistics, decided that the time had come to make credit scarce through the universe of gold. That's translated from Welsh, but it's the usual thing. He did it in other poems as well, and speeches, and articles. Now, he did it into the First World War, into the Second World War. Initially doubted reports of the Holocaust as propaganda. Later, of course, realised how wrong he'd been, but never admitted it. Subsequent to the Second World War, he wrote a play called Esther, about the story of Esther, entirely sympathetic with Jewish interests. He wrote 2 plays about the von Stauffenberg plotters against Hitler, in which they are the heroes and he can't be the villain. This is a belated and oblique form of expiation, but he never admitted he was anti-Semitic. I did a television program on him in 2002. I interviewed his daughter, who was then in the 60s or 70s, and she told me, oh no, he wasn't anti-Semitic. He told me, she said, he couldn't be anti-Semitic because a Jewish doctor had saved his wife's life at her in childbirth and consequently her life. And of course, I'm sure he said that, I'm sure he believed that, I'm sure she believes that, but of course, sadly, he did go through that. But he's a major thing. And during the Second World War, he stood for Parliament and was opposed. He was quite a right-winger, he was opposed by a liberal called W.J. Griffith, who mocked his ideas of Catholicism and traditionalism coming from a left perspective. And he accused Saunders of being a fascist, which is ironic, because Griffith in 1941 wrote the following, and he listed the threats to Wales, and here he said, North Wales, full of rich and crafty Jews. It's 1941. Full of the people he's talking about are refugees from bombing in northern English cities who fled to the countryside, along with many non-Jewish people, but he singles them out. Full of rich and crafty Jews, who lap up all the resources of the country and leave the poor natives deprived and helpless. And by the way, is it not time for someone to protest openly against these Jews who have become a burden on Llandudno, Colwyn Bay, Abergele and the surrounding countryside? Are the Jews completely unable to learn a lesson from the history of their nation in other countries? I had a conversation the other day with 2 or 3 of them, and I was shocked by their attitudes to the events around them. They do not yet realise that they have had any responsibility at all for their afflicted state as a people in the Nazi countries. It appears that they have 2 main aims, and 2 alone: escaping from every danger in every place, whatever the danger to other people, and carrying forward their old traditional manner of enriching themselves on the weaknesses of the Gentile. Anti-Semitism, you say? No. Just trying to give a word of warning in time to a nation which deserves the best the world can give it, but which is in real danger in this country, as in every other country, if they continue to behave as they are. if they do not heed the warning, there will be a problem in Wales as well as in England. And when a nation becomes a problem, it is vain for it to expect justice from the folk who suffer under the results of that problem. The sad thing is that an insignificant journal like the Llenor, that's the name of the magazine where he's writing this of which the world knows virtually nothing, is the only place a warning like this can appear. There's a simple reason for that. Very few papers, except the Welsh language papers, do not have the finger of the Jews in them, directly or otherwise. And this is the guy who called Saunders Lewis the fascist. And that was later than Saunders Lewis's own thing, own expression. So, you can find anti-Semitism on the left and the right of the political spectrum throughout modern Welsh history, even though public opinion was largely Philo-Semitic. So these are attached. I've looked for other examples. There are a few references in Welsh literature, the odd stereotypical fictional Jewish plutocrat here, the odd passing reference elsewhere, and I have come across casual anti-Semitism as well, ever since I've identified with this subject. Comments and things. I was in the political conference the other day, and last autumn, a year ago, and I was sitting there minding my own business, and I heard somebody discussing getting a drink from the bar and who was going to pay, and one of them remarked cheerily, "Oh, all the Jews out in Jerusalem." Supposed meanness, and that's 2006. So this casual old anti-Semitism. Now, anti-Semitism has found partners in all cultures, and it's taken justification from entirely contradictory public events, from the successes of the Jewish people, from their failures, their strengths, their weaknesses. So why am I enumerating just one more culture which has been infected by this virus? Well, I hope there may be some use in showing how a community's intelligentsia can move in less than a century from an overwhelming Philo-Semitism and public endorsement of Zionism, an endorsement it was prepared to back with costly military force, to a situation mainly of indifference, but where strong public voices can be anti-Zionist and in some cases anti-Semitic. So I want to look in these last few minutes at that new anti-Semitism. And again, I've come across aspects of this. I went to Israel in 2004 as a guest of the Israeli Foreign Ministry and was subject to very public criticism for this. And some of the criticism of Israel, of course, as you're well aware, shades into anti-Semitism as well, as it does in Wales. So these sentiments, Jew equals Israeli, equals the bone of contention, equals the enemy of the modern Welshman, long live the Welshman, bugger the Jew, they seem a long way from the sense of solidarity with which nationally minded Welsh people regarded Zionism 90 years previously. I think that kind of solidarity seems unimaginable today. I think there are three major factors which have influenced this change. I think the first is the disappearance of that community's ability to project its power on a world stage. For a brief period at the turn of the 20th century, when Wales was at the height of its industrial power, when its religious constituency was at its strongest, and when a patriotic Welshman was the British Prime Minister, and with a coterie of Welsh advisors, a kind of Celtic Camelot, Welsh national aspirations found themselves aligned with the centre of British power, and with unique access to it. The later collapse of the Welsh industrial economy, the rapid decline of religion, and the breach in the personal connection with the power centre, and the subsequent divergence of Welsh and British interests pushed the Welsh intelligentsia into nearly a century of marginalisation and opposition. This has fostered a disengagement from the sobering responsibility of exercising power and taking the consequences of so doing, and has allowed the growth instead of the intoxicating experience of advocating the use of power by others in the knowledge that such advocacy will have no consequences for the advocates. So, is it possible that impotence can provide a more fertile breeding ground for supremacy for anti-Semitism? Perhaps societies which feel powerless, marginalised and threatened can be particularly susceptible to the infection of anti-Semitism. The second factor is the near disappearance of Christian religious observance in Wales as a whole, including among nationalists. Evangelical Protestantism, while occasionally in tension with Judaism in the past, as we've seen, nonetheless provided a widespread awareness of the Jewish people, of their sacred scriptures, and a firm theological underpinning of Gentile Jewish sympathy. The enfeeblement of that evangelical Protestantism has created ignorance and alienation, which again can allow prejudices to flourish. And thirdly, and finally, there's the change in perception of the Jewish people from oppressed to oppressors, causing elements, and only elements, not all in the language, but elements in the nationalistic Welsh intelligentsia, which derives much of its sense of self-esteem from its identification with the underdog, to shift its sympathies. Now, by no means all nationalists are automatically anti-Israel. The anti-Israel voices, however, are often dominant. At worst, I suspect there's a desire to feel affirmed through righteous grievance, a habit which has grown through long disenfranchisement, has become detached from its original object, which is the now largely resolved dispute between Wales and England, and is now using the Arab-Israel conflict as a kind of pornography for the conscience, gratifying the desire for righteous indignation while not requiring involvement or commitment. Now, it's tempting to look for comparisons with the current situation and wonder if a similar complex of secularization, impaired capacity to project power, and shifting sympathies might foster the further growth of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in the West generally. I'll stop short of drawing any such definite conclusions or from offering any predictions. I think history is too unpredictable for that. But I hope that what we've studied has provided us with some food for thought. So I'll summarize by saying that in the case of this community, a strain of latent anti-Semitism contracted time out of mind from original European Christian prejudice against the Jewish people, had long been held in check by the antibodies of enlightened evangelical Protestantism and by a consciousness of the responsibilities of power, but the removal of those antibodies, the debilitation of that society's influence and sense of responsibility to political marginalization and cultural decay has allowed the virus to grow again in a new mutation. And this has created a disorder in which that society's long inculcated habit of deriving self-esteem from identifying with the righteous grievance of the oppressed has, with the resolution of the main cause of its own oppression, found in anti-Israel sentiments shading sometimes into anti-Semitism, an all too easy path to continued gratification. Thank you.
So thank you very much. So we have some time for question and answers, and I would like to take the opportunity to start off. That's okay. I have two quick questions. The first one is more of a point of clarification. You spoke in depth about how the Welsh were identified with the liberation of Israel around the first period of the First World War, and that a lot of Welsh troops participated in the exercise and gave their lives to remove the Turkish from the. So my question is, what happened between that period and the period in the 1930s and 40s when Jewish refugees were escaping from Europe and were arriving in Palestine, and British troops in many cases escorted them back to Europe to certain death, or brought them to Cyprus, and in some cases literally shot from Haifa into the refugee ships arriving on the shore. So what happened between the period of Welsh identifying with sort of a biblical notion of liberating Israel and then this period of time?
I think the answer to that is that it was too complicated for the Welsh public to get a handle on it. I think that's what that troubled period, mandate period there, where, of course, you know, the riots and the two competing communities, the British trying to keep them apart, it didn't register so highly in public life. It wasn't a clear-cut conflict, and the idea of a crusade, you know, this acquiring Palestine in the First World War was a prestige objective, and of what military value it was, I'm not so sure, but it was a prestige objective, and it was a huge symbolic value, and it was easy to understand good against evil, and consequently it produced visual images and tied into a nice narrative with the beginning of conquest, and then the messy aftermath, I don't think registered to the same degree. Also, the sadly, foreign wars only register at home when there are large-scale casualties, and there were not large-scale casualties. It was a drip of casualties like there were in many British colonies at the time. And it didn't register highly enough for it to produce much of a blip in Welsh public opinion. It focused again during the United Nations vote but then mainly among nationalistically minded people who wanted it to happen, and the dwindling but still fervent evangelical community who wanted it for religious reasons.
So this sort of brings me to the second part of the question, which is to what extent, when you were speaking of Philo-Semitism and Anti-Semitism, I was also imagining notions of Lawrence of Arabia and sort of British notions of otherness, of Orientalism, the exotic Arab, which was also sort of competing at the same moment. So to what extent is this whole process of relating to the Jew a part of empire building, expanding empire, maintaining dominance over certain parts of the world, and reaching out in a sense to identify what to change, is this part of the empire building or and the reality of the moment, or?
I think at that stage it was empire maintaining, and yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It was, and I think Lloyd George indicates that he goes into this great peroration about admiration and identification and mutual respect, etc., 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 and we wanted your help. It was the last line. That is the bottom line, literally the bottom line. They wanted Jewish influence and help in the First World War effort. They thought it would help influence Russia, to keep Russia in the war. They thought it would keep America, bring America in, and keep America in the war, and so on. So that's what he thought he could get out of giving some design. Yes, it was absolutely part of the imperial project. It wasn't altruistic, but it pulled in altruistic energies into it. But it wasn't purely altruistic. The Orientalism, and this is the irony of it, at exactly the same time, they were sponsoring Lawrence in the competing project in the same time, and telling him to tell the Arabs that they can have their freedom, just get rid of themselves, and we'll sort it all out afterwards somehow. And they were competing projects. Lawrence, I got a passage from Lawrence was born in Wales, in fact, and if you ever find yourself in North West Wales, I've taken Jewish visitors there occasionally and showed them where Lloyd George is buried, and his childhood home where he's buried, and where Lawrence of Arabia was born. They're within about 3 miles of one another. You can do the whole of Middle East history in 3 miles. And Lawrence was Welsh born, had a distant identification with Wales, was openly sceptical about Zionism during the First World War, and of course sponsored British interests for an entirely competing project, the consequences of which were still living.
What does the Welsh intelligentsia currently make of the Muslim immigration into Great Britain?
Right, now that's interesting. Now with this, when I say Welsh intelligentsia, I mean that primitive, nationalistically minded minority of a minority, but still the ones who will tend to be custodians of cultural vehicles and journals and so on. Many of them are disproportionately influential as cultural gatekeepers. Now, this is an interesting and troubling question. In fact, my next book is going to be Wales and the Muslims. I'm just getting involved with it now. I don't know a great deal about it. What I've seen so far has been generally a visceral reluctance to side with any opposition to Muslim interests. And that comes from a long inculcated habit of not being nasty to minorities of any kind, and also not doing anything that the British state wants to do. So whether that is standing up for God Save the Queen, or joining the British Armed Forces, or being cautious about Muslim immigration and possible radicalisation, then that strand of oppositional thinking will instinctively run counter to it, and consequently not be confident of immigration or radicalisation, for I suspect those pretty negative reasons. Although there have been exceptions, and I know of at least 3 influential cultural commentators within that community who have been sceptical and by no means antagonistic, but certainly openly sceptical, and who have criticised that very tendency within the community. So I'm not a lone voice in arguing for a more nuanced approach either to the Jewish people or to the Muslims. There are other people doing the same thing as well.
You mentioned before that the population of Wales was approximately 3 million, approximately how many Jewish people?
At the height of the Jewish community, as I said, there were small Sephardi mercantile communities from the 18th century on, which grew very slowly. Then the great wave of emigration in the late 19th century, for all the reasons we know, a part of that washed into Wales, and by 1914, which was the height of the Welsh industrial power, there were 6,000 Jewish people in Wales, maximum. And they started moving out almost as soon as they reached that point, because the coal industry started declining. And this is the strange thing. Since I've done this, people ask me, well, what are you working on? I'm doing a book about Wales and the Jews. I say, used to be a lot of Jews in insert name of town, left when the money went, they said. I said, yes. I said, so did most of the Welsh people. But of course, the Jewish mobility seems to be uniquely sinister, doesn't it? So yeah, they moved out and emigrated from the industrial districts to the coastal cities, and increasingly from there to London and across to Israel. And now there's 1,000 Jewish people connected with the community, and according to the census, a further 1,000 people who must be of Jewish descent.
My father lived in Wales from 1900 to 1917 in Port Talbot, up Everard, before he emigrated to the U.S. And I wondered about communication between the Welsh and the Jews. So I read a very interesting article today called How Greeners Come to the Valley by Michael Wallach. And in this article, I need a clarification from you. He says, what emerged clearly from my talk with Welsh Jews is that while they are grateful to the country that welcomed them and are friendly with their non-Jewish neighbors, they will never be able to sing, and I can't pronounce the Welsh national anthem with true Welsh fervor. As one of the Welsh-speaking Jews told me, half in jest, to be a real Welshman, you must be chapel. Now what does this signify?
Okay, well, this, the chapel church divide is largely a Gentile game in Wales, or entirely a Gentile game, but it stems from the fact that the Anglican Church in Britain as a whole was traditionally identified with the ruling class, with the landowners, with the royal family. It was the state-established church. It had all the privileges of that, including its own taxation system, which people had to pay to, and it also had all the abuses that went with that, indolence and corruption and so on. This was felt particularly by those people who were Puritans and who couldn't get along with that kind of system. And of course, the Puritans came here, didn't they, in large numbers, or many of them did. So that they were people who had dissented from the Anglican Church. In Wales, the rupture between people who dissented from Anglicanism was made much stronger by the fact that Anglicanism was identified with an English-speaking ruling class, and dissent, non-conformity, and the chapel became increasingly the religion of the ordinary Welsh-speaking common people of Wales. So the rupture took on an extra dimension, or an extra ethnic and linguistic dimension, and that became numerically and demographically by far the dominant proportion of Welsh Christianity. The chapel was much, much stronger in Wales than church being Anglicanism, and that it tended then to put its stamp on secular Welsh culture as well, including its nationalism and its music and so on. And Anglicanism within Wales was marginalised as being a kind of Englishman's religion. And I'm actually a church man myself rather than a chapel goer, so I'm in that side of the divide. And in fact, non-conformity was sufficiently strong politically by 1914 to force through a bill disestablishing the church in Wales. So Wales doesn't have a state church. England does. The Anglican Church of England is the state religion. In Scotland, the Presbyterian Church is the established state religion. Wales doesn't have state religion. It has an Anglican church, but it's not an established church. It's just a denomination like any other. It sometimes behaves as if it's still the established church, but it is Welsh non-conformity was strong enough to actually force it to be disestablished against its will, and did so. So that's what he means really, is that Welsh nationalism tends to have a religious element to it, and that element tends to be non-conformist, Presbyterian, Baptist, etc. Chapter.
Thank you.
Oh, yes, sorry.
I imagine that you get a broad variety of responses when you present your argument in Wales and England. Can you characterize some of these responses?
Yes. I think the strangest response was when I did this talk. So I've not done an anti-Semitic talk before. I've done a survey of the whole field. I did it to a group in Mid Wales of Messianic Jewish believers and Jews for Jesus, and their more numerous Christian supporters. And I'm not a conversionist at all. But I went there to give a historical lecture, and I got to the first quote, one of those prayers about conversion, and they all started shouting Amen, Hallelujah. And every time I came to one of these quotes, and there were more in that lecture than in this, they started kind of shouting, yeah, praise the Lord, Amen, Hallelujah. And I thought, gosh, I'm giving a historical lecture, and they're hearing a sermon. So that was strange. Now that kind of conversionism, that kind of is very, very small constituency indeed. So that's not common. I found Jewish audiences in Wales generally stop me halfway through and say, he was my uncle, but I get to various Jewish writers and I say, oh, I knew him. He was my uncle, so I get much more involvement in that sense. And also I found people surprised at how weak Christianity is in Wales currently, because Wales was historically much more religious than England, and that graph has fallen with spectacular speed during the 20th century in Wales, almost to vanishing point. You could put a date on its vanishing point, the way it's going. So I found people surprised by that, because the cultural expectations of the Welsh people are more religious than English people, but it's no longer true. So I found people surprised by that.
Now, about that, and that's one of the reasons for the rise in modern anti-Semitism. Why is there this decline in Christianity in Wales, and what is it being replaced by, if anything? And just quick, would you predict that if this happens, the same decline happens in other countries, let's say Ireland, would it have the same result? And also, I just want to put it after that, what is is a similar situation going on now in Ireland? Is there much anti-Semitism in Ireland?
I'm afraid I don't know about Ireland. I don't think there's that big a Jewish community there historically. Yeah. And I seem to remember Hitler's plan for the invasion of Britain, where they'd enumerated the number of Jews in different places. I think there were 3,000 in Ireland, and they'd even enumerated those. So I don't think it was very large then. There would be more in Wales then. So I don't know about Irish.
But as far as the first part of my question, what is it being replaced by Christianity? Why is it disappearing?
I think there are various factors, and I think why is it declining? I think it's still going through a cycle of response to science in the modern world generally. I think Christianity in Wales is still has not, and in Britain generally, has not come up with a convincing response to the claims of science as opposed to religion. And here in the US, it's different. It's held up against that. It's mutated and adapted. And I think in outside theological circles, in general culture, I think it feels like a failed metaphor generally. It feels like a failed worldview to most British people. And coupled with that, what's it being replaced by? On fringes with spirituality, New Age spirituality, that kind of thing. And mainly by consumerism, which is consumerism, entirely self-sufficient, fulfilling way of life and worldview, which can take you from the cradle to the grave without knowing anything about Christianity. I had a young lady with me on work experience recently, and I needed to send her an email. I asked her for her first name, she told me. And your second name, Jordan. She said, oh, like the river. She long pause. Oh, yes, I suppose so. And I said, but nobody ever said, like the river. She said, no. Am I supposed to say, like the supermodel? She said, yes. And what can I say? This lady, 20s, graduate, educated, you can go through cradle to the grave and not know River Jordan or anything else, and that is sadly what it's like. And I can tell you the figures. Wales, 12% of the people go to church at least once a month. In Northern Ireland, it's 45%. How long that will last, I don't know, because there's a big political component in that church world. In England, it is higher than Wales. It's 14, not much. Scotland, it's 18. So those are people going at least once a month, and which is a fairly minimal measure of commitment. The interesting thing is that in London, if you take London separately, it's 25%. London is actually the most religious single part of the UK. A lot of that is immigration from West Africa and the Caribbean. So London is actually more religious than anywhere else. The most modern, most technically secular places. Yeah. I think that's best answer I can give. It seems to be going through a cycle. It hasn't reached bottom yet. It's still dying.
So would you predict that something similar could happen in other countries then? As in Wales?
I would say that I don't know enough about other countries to speculate. I only know really Wales and the UK well enough. I couldn't extrapolate confidently. Sorry, oh yes.
I'm just wondering if there have been other oppressed minorities apart from the Jews that Wales culturally, in the minds of its people, has related to the way it had related to the Jews.
Right. The only major one, I think, historically, has been the Irish, who came over in very large numbers from the family, because we were the nearest country. I mean, lots of Irish people came here, of course, but we were the nearest country, so we had lots of Irish people, family refugees. And in the mid-19th century, that caused huge issues in public policy and street fights and riots and deep antagonism, because they were Catholic, Welsh were Protestant, they were English or Irish speaking, Welsh were Welsh speaking. So, and they worked for less money, and so there were big tensions over that, which are now entirely forgotten. You'd have to remind even somebody of Irish ancestry in Wales of those facts, because they're entirely forgotten. But that was the biggest one, and in its day it was a very big deal. But it didn't have the deep ideological involvement which the Jewish involvement did. And there haven't been other minorities historically with the same numerical or symbolic or political influence. So, yeah. Oh, yes.
What about the whole involvement of the Welsh people in African slavery and African slave trade? That the abolition movements often borrowed from the idea of redeeming Israel and people that were oppressed and so on. Did that vocabulary bring itself in chapel and abolitionists and so on?
Yes, Welsh people, there was a strong abolitionist movement in Wales, but the interesting thing is that Welsh America, because there were very, very many Welsh speakers in America, at least 4,000 Welsh speakers took part in the American Civil War, all but 12 of them on the northern side. Took part in the second of that, even though people like Jefferson Davis were of Welsh ancestry, but distant Welsh. Welsh American public opinion, which was strong, vigorous, had its many journals published in North America in Welsh, Welsh public opinion in North America during that period was overwhelmingly and almost entirely abolitionist, without any dissent voices at all within Welsh America. In Wales, ironically at the time, it was less abolitionist. Welsh public opinion at the time was more sceptical towards abolition, and in some cases by some competitive slavery. Not exclusively so, but the main difference really was between Welsh America, which was entirely on the side of abolition, and domestic Welsh opinion, which was more, in some ways I suppose, identified with British interests, which of course sat on the fence for a long while, wasn't there, regarding the
Despite the unification of Europe, let's say, in the European Union, there seems to be, on the other hand, this counterweight of many small linguistic minorities, etc., like the Welsh or the Latvians or others, trying to assert themselves. Now, how does this play out in terms of Israel, Jews versus Arab or Palestinians? Do they have any solidarity with the Jewish nation as a small linguistic group?
Do they have? Again, I'm afraid I don't know how it plays out elsewhere. I do recall during the Northern Ireland troubles that, which are very recently resolved, 700 years in I remember that each party picked a side in the Arab-Israeli conflict as a proxy for their own side. So the Protestants would put up Israel flags alongside the Union Jack, as seeing themselves as true believers surrounded by infidels. And in response, the Republicans identified with Palestine, with the Palestinian flag. So there's a classic case of a proxy conflict going on. I don't know how the relations.
Well, just as a follow-up on a response to that, also I'm thinking of how in recent years the Roman Catholic Church officially has rebuked anti-Semitism, and the Pope has made all kinds of statements that we are spiritual Semites and all this, and yet you find the Catholic Republicans taking the Palestinian side, so it's not that, it's much more complicated.
It is complicated, yes. There's an awful lot of grey areas, and I hope I haven't given too simplistic an impression here, because it's the situation is quite nuanced, and I wouldn't want to give the impression that it is simplistic. I'm just interested as to how the same impulse, this impulse of solidarity with the oppressed, can shift sides in the course of quite a short historical period, and from intense identification to that. But I'm not talking the entire population being so, or the entire intelligence, there's elements within it. But for the same reasons, coming to a different response within a matter of, well, a lifetime.
So, first of all, on behalf of USA, thank you very much for a very rich and nuanced. Also, thank you for organizing this and bringing you here. It's very kind. And also for people here, some of Graham's books are available for purchase. They're just over there. And yeah, I think everybody. Yeah. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.